No one ever dared go near the old Wayland Farm stables after dark. The roof caved in long ago, weeds twisted through splintered boards, and the rumor around Southridge County was that a wild black mustang haunted the paddock. A beast who'd once crushed a grown man's leg and nearly ripped down the barn doors in a blind fury. Still, at sunset, a pack of kids with scraped shins and sneakers full of summer dust gathered behind the fence, hearts pounding as the last rays slid across the cracked earth. Emily Carver clutched the frayed leather of her backpack strap, standing a little apart from the others. At 11, she was small for her age, quick-footed, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and hair tied in the same braid her late father used to do for her on patrol mornings. She kept his old police badge strung on a chain beneath her shirt. Some days, she pressed it so hard to her chest that it left a red impression. Logan Deems, 12, taller by a head and full of swagger, spat into the grass. "Go on, Carver. Scared?" His friends snickered, egging him on, but their voices wobbled at the edges. Everyone knew Logan liked pushing people until they broke, usually with a dare. Emily's voice barely wavered. "It's just a horse, Logan," he grinned. "Not just any horse. They say he went crazy. Bit a trainer, kicked a hole in the fence, wild as a devil. Bet you don't last 5 minutes locked in there." Logan pulled a battered phone from his hoodie, its cracked screen glinting. "Let's give the internet something to talk about." Emily glanced at the paddock. The boards looked rotten enough to snap if someone sneezed. Behind the shadows, something massive moved, black as midnight, the sort of black that seemed to soak up all the color from the world. Emily saw a single jagged white scar slashing across the Mustang's chest. His breath steamed in the cooling air. Her heart hammered so hard she wondered if the others could hear it. She could just walk away. Nobody would blame her. But then she felt the shape of her dad's badge, cool and familiar beneath her palm, and remembered the way he'd faced things, not with fists, but with a steady look and a word no one could argue with. "Stand your ground." Emily squared her shoulders. "Fine. Open it." The latch creaked and the boys backed away, Logan shoving Emily forward. For a split second she hesitated, but she stepped through, head high, while her hands shook just enough that she had to ball them into fists. Inside, time seemed to slow. The Mustang, Storm, people called him, though no one knew where he'd come from, stood perfectly still, his mane tangled and wild, eyes glinting. The fence slammed shut behind her. The other kids jeered, but their voices faded as Storm took a step forward, hooves striking the packed earth with a heavy, deliberate thud. Emily's breath came short and sharp. She fought the urge to bolt, knowing instinct told horses more than words ever could. She remembered old stories, her dad teaching her about his patrol horse, how they trusted you only if you stood steady, how fear was like gasoline to a fire. She swallowed, whispering just loud enough for Storm to hear. "Hey boy, I'm not here to hurt you." Storm's ears flicked forward. He drew closer, so close that Emily saw flecks of dried mud and scars on his shoulder. Stories etched in silence. His head lowered, breath hot and slow. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, gripping her dad's badge, waiting for a blow, a bite, any sign of fury. She felt his breath on her cheek. But then, Storm pressed his forehead gently against her shoulder. For a moment, the world went still. The laughter from outside faded, replaced by the sound of wind rattling the loose gate and the rhythmic thump of Storm's heart against hers. Emily opened her eyes. Logan and his crew had gone silent, watching with wide eyes. Someone was filming through the slats in the fence. Storm stayed there, unmoving. Emily didn't flinch. She raised a trembling hand, placed it on the Mustang's neck, and let out a slow breath. Storm didn't shy away. Instead, he let his weight rest a little heavier, a silent promise in the failing light. Logan's voice shook. "No way." Storm stepped back, his massive chest rising and falling, but his eyes, deep, dark, knowing, never left Emily. He turned, flicked his tail, and walked to the far end of the paddock, pausing only to look over his shoulder once before the sun dipped below the trees. Emily stood alone in the fading golden haze, the other kids too stunned to laugh. The paddock gate creaked open, Logan's hand shaking as he pulled her out. He looked at her as if seeing a ghost. The group scattered, but not before the video hit send. Somewhere behind them a phone pinged, a camera rolled, and the image of Emily and Storm, girl and legend, fear and trust, started its journey through the world. That night, as Emily lay in bed, the glow of her phone illuminating the first flurry of notifications, she pressed her father's badge to her lips and whispered, "I did it, Dad. I really did it." Outside, the air smelled like old hay and coming rain, and in the abandoned paddock, Storm raised his head to the night, not wild or broken, but waiting, for what, no one could say. Not yet. By sunrise, the world had already changed for Emily Carver. She didn't realize it until she walked into the schoolyard that Monday, her phone vibrating in her pocket like a tiny storm she couldn't control. Everywhere she looked, heads were bent over screens. Groups clustered at the water fountain, eyes wide, voices hushed, as if a ghost had been caught on camera. She tried to keep her head down, wishing she could melt into her faded jacket, but it was no use. Someone spotted her. Jessica Myers, who could turn gossip into wildfire. "Hey, that's her! That's the girl with the killer horse!" The crowd parted, and Logan stood in the middle, arms crossed, jaw set. He said nothing, but his eyes flicked to Emily and then away, shame and something like fear in his posture. She walked past, heart thudding, but the words stuck. Killer horse, daredevil, crazy girl. She wanted to scream that Storm was just a horse, her father's horse, maybe even a hero, but already the story was spinning out of her hands. All it took was a few seconds of video, Storm lowering his head, Emily standing her ground, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. At lunch, a group of older boys crowded her table. "You gonna train him for the rodeo, Carver?" They snickered, but when she looked at them, really looked, she saw uncertainty in their faces, as if they weren't sure if she was brave or reckless or just plain lucky. She said nothing, only gripped the reins of her lunchbox tighter. It didn't stop at school. By afternoon, word reached the sheriff's office. The deputies passed around a phone, watching the clip in a tight circle. Sheriff Baker, a friend of her father's, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "That's the old Mustang from Wayland's place?" Thought he was uncatchable. His deputy shook his head. The Carver girl just stood there, didn't even flinch. But listen to this. He played the clip again, and on the edges of the video, a voice whispered, "He's gonna charge. Watch out." The next thing Emily knew, people started talking not about courage but about danger. Rumors grew like weeds. Someone claimed Storm had chased her. Another said he tried to bite. A parent called the school, demanding to know why wild animals were loose where children played. Even Sheriff Baker came by the Carver's porch that evening, hat in hand, concern written deep in his wrinkles. Emily's grandmother, Elsie, met him at the door. She stood tall, her silver hair pulled back, the lines on her face carved by years of drought and heartbreak. "He's not dangerous, Baker. That horse is part of this family." The sheriff's eyes softened. "I know, Elsie. But folks are scared. The mayor's getting calls, and there's talk of—" he hesitated. "There's talk of putting the horse down." The words hit Emily like a punch to the chest. She wanted to shout, to protest, but her voice stuck. She looked at her grandmother, who placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We won't let that happen. Not after all this horse has been through." After the sheriff left, Emily sat on the porch swing, knees tucked up, clutching her father's old reins. She remembered him explaining every knot, every crease in the worn leather, how each told a story, how the strongest bonds came from years of trust and trial. She wondered if Storm remembered those lessons too, or if he just carried scars now, the way she did. That night, as dusk settled over the fields, an old Chevy rattled down the drive. Miss Tilda climbed out, a former trainer, her limp a souvenir from a lifetime with horses. She walked slow, every step deliberate, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Elsie called out, "Evening, Tilda. Come to see trouble or help fix it?" Tilda grinned, her voice like gravel. "Bit of both." She held up her phone. The video paused at the moment Storm bowed his head to Emily. "I saw something in that horse. Something I haven't seen since Officer Carver." She looked at Emily. "Do you know what that horse's name was before Waylon bought him?" Emily shook her head, heart pounding. "Nightstorm," Tilda whispered. "He belonged to your daddy. I trained them both. He was the finest patrol horse this county ever saw." The words spun in Emily's mind, pieces falling into place. No wonder Storm had seemed so familiar, so watchful. She remembered vague stories, her dad coming home with straw in his boots, talking about a horse who could outsmart any gate and stand unflinching in a riot. Tilda sat beside Emily on the porch, her hands shaking as she replayed the video again. "After your dad, after the accident, that horse disappeared. Came back wild. Wouldn't let anyone near. Folks said he was broken, maybe dangerous. But I see the way he looks at you. That's not a wild horse. That's a guardian, looking for someone he knows." Emily's eyes stung. She pressed the badge to her chest, desperate to believe. Elsie nodded, her voice thick. "Storm was lost to us when we lost Charlie. Maybe he found his way home through her." The next morning, the debate only got hotter. The video went viral, shared by strangers, dissected by neighbors. Some comments were full of awe. "Look at her. Look at the way he listens." Others demanded action. That horse should be put down before a real tragedy happens. Emily felt trapped between worlds. The legacy of her father, the hysteria of the town, the loyalty she felt to Storm, and the fear that she would lose him before she ever really knew him. One afternoon, she slipped away from the noise and arguments, walking out to the paddock at Wayland Farm. She found Storm standing in the shade, head low, as if he understood everything that was happening beyond the fence. She pressed her hand to the scar on his chest, feeling the warmth beneath. "You remember Dad, don't you?" she whispered. "You remember everything. They're wrong about you, just like they were wrong about him." Storm's ear flicked. He nudged her gently, breath soft and steady. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Emily made herself a promise. No matter what the town decided, she wouldn't let fear win. She would fight for Storm, with her words, with her heart, with every ounce of courage she'd inherited from her father. And somewhere inside, a spark of hope flared. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. Southridge's early autumn air always held a certain chill, sharp and clean, the kind that slipped under doors and curled around the bones. It was a comfort to Emily as she made her way to her grandparents' old homestead, a rambling place at the edge of the woods, painted white in her memory, but faded to gray by years of storms and sun. Inside, everything seemed touched by history. The air held the smell of saddle soap, hay, and the faint sweetness of apples from the gnarled tree in the yard. This was where Emily found herself most nights after the town's judgment became too much, where voices of the present faded and the past felt near enough to touch. She tiptoed through the kitchen, careful not to wake Elsie, and made her way out back, past the chicken coop and the sagging fence, toward the old tack room where her father had once spent countless hours with Nightstorm, Storm, cleaning saddles, mending bridles, and sneaking her sips of sweet tea when Elsie wasn't looking. The tack room looked untouched for years, but Emily knew every creak in the floorboards. She knelt by a wooden trunk beneath the window, pulling it open with both hands. Inside were yellowed photographs, faded newspaper clippings, and a stack of notebooks in her father's careful handwriting. Records of patrols, sketches of trails, and lists of riding commands. There was even a frayed blue ribbon from a county fair, still pinned to a photograph of a younger version of her dad atop a sleek black Mustang. She traced the line of Storm's familiar face in the photo, the same white scar barely visible beneath his mane. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "You never left him, did you?" she whispered. A soft shuffle made her turn. Elsie appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her patchwork robe, gray hair spilling down her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked gently. Emily shook her head. "I wanted to remember. I wanted to know what it was like when Dad and Storm were together." Elsie came in and sat beside her, hands folded in her lap. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Elsie reached into the trunk and pulled out a faded Polaroid. Her dad, grinning, with Storm's head draped over his shoulder like a loyal dog. "That horse would have followed him into a burning building," Elsie said quietly. "And after your daddy's accident, Storm came back here all on his own." Emily's breath caught. "You mean he came back after Dad died?" Elsie nodded, eyes distant, recalling the hardest months of her life. "He showed up one morning, mud-caked, blood on his flank, limping but alive. Wouldn't let anyone near him, not for weeks. We left food out, kept the gate open, hoped he'd trust us again. But he was changed, Emmy. The light in his eyes was different." Emily pressed the Polaroid to her chest, feeling the weight of grief that seemed to have settled over both her and Storm, binding them in silent understanding. That night, unable to sleep, she crept outside to the barn, the moon high and bright enough to turn the fields to silver. She found Storm standing in his stall, head lowered, his coat gleaming in the cool light. Emily took a deep breath and spread out her father's old jacket beside the stall, curling up on the scratchy hay. For a moment, she just listened to Storm's quiet breathing, the rustle of his mane, the distant hoot of an owl. "Everyone thinks you ran," she murmured, "but you didn't, did you? You stayed. You're still here, just like me." Storm shuffled closer. To Emily's surprise, he reached his big muzzle over the stall door, gently tugging at the pocket of her jacket. She laughed softly and dug into the pocket, pulling out a chewed photograph, the same one she'd found in the trunk. Storm nosed it, his lips tracing the image of her father's smiling face. Emily's throat tightened. It was as if the Mustang carried grief in the same quiet, heavy way she did. Never crying out, never lashing out, just bearing the weight and carrying on. She leaned against the rough wood, speaking softly. "You lost him too, didn't you? But you didn't give up." The hours stretched on. Emily drifted in and out of sleep, comforted by the steady, rhythmic sound of Storm breathing nearby. In the pale light of dawn, she awoke to find Storm standing over her, silent and watchful, as if keeping guard through the night. School was harder than ever after that. The rumors had spread. Some kids crossed the street when they saw her, Others looked at her like she was a legend or a curse. Teachers whispered in the hallways, and even the adults at the store eyed her with caution. Emily did her best to ignore it, but the loneliness felt suffocating at times. At home, however, things were different. Each evening, Emily went out to the barn and sat with Storm, reading from her father's notebooks, practicing old patrol commands. Sometimes she'd talk to him about her day, about the ache of missing her dad, about how she didn't fit in with the other kids anymore. Storm listened in silence, eyes steady, occasionally bumping her with his nose as if to say, "I understand." One particularly cold evening, as Emily finished reading aloud from a page titled Night Patrol, Storm surprised her by lowering his head and nosing the reins she held. He took the leather gently in his teeth, holding it as he used to with her father. It was a small gesture, but for Emily it meant everything. She pressed her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of hay and horse, feeling the warmth radiate from his scarred chest. "We're going to get through this," she whispered. "You and me. We'll remember him together." In the quiet of the barn, with only Storm for company, Emily realized that grief wasn't something to run from or be ashamed of. It was something to hold, something that could bind people and animals across years and distance. Storm didn't run from his pain. He carried it, just like Emily. And in that shared, unspoken understanding, something new began to grow. Not hope exactly, but a sense of purpose. Together, they would find a way forward, no matter what the world thought. The first rays of dawn slipped over the rolling hills behind Wayland Farm, brushing the fields with gold and waking the world in gentle silence. Emily stood in the cool morning, watching her breath fog in the air. She pressed her father's riding log to her chest, heart thrumming with nervous excitement. Today was the day she'd really try, to reach Storm, not as the frightened animal everyone else saw, but as her father's horse, the one she believed still lived behind those guarded eyes. She slipped quietly through the dewy grass, boots leaving wet prints, and found Storm standing near the fence, nose buried in a patch of wild clover. The farm was peaceful at this hour. The chaos of the town and the rumors swirling around them held at bay by the hush of sunrise. Emily climbed through the slats of the old paddock, her every move deliberate, slow, remembering her father's words, "A horse listens best when you listen first." Storm's ears flicked as she approached, but he didn't back away. Emily crouched down, keeping her eyes gentle, her posture open. "Hey, big guy," she whispered. "Let's start over." She opened her father's logbook and read aloud the first entry. Basic commands, exercises, a memory of trust. The words steadied her. She moved as her dad had taught her. Hand low, voice soft, never rushing. She held out the halter. Storm tensed, snorting, muscles coiled beneath his scarred hide. Emily waited, patience blooming in the quiet morning. She didn't plead or flinch. She just stood, holding space as if promising she would never force him into anything. Finally, after long minutes, Storm stepped forward. He lowered his massive head, nostrils flaring, and for the first time in years, let someone slip a halter over his ears. A tear slid down Emily's cheek. She laughed, a real, startled laugh that cut through the silence. "You remember," she said. "You really do." She led him slowly around the paddock, her hand steady on the lead, using the old commands her father had written. Storm hesitated at first, but each word seemed to spark a memory. He responded, not perfectly, not every time, but enough to make Emily's heart leap. She led him over a set of makeshift jumps, built from fallen logs and rusted barrels. Storm took them, clumsy but willing, snorting in surprise when he cleared the last one. From the porch, Elsie watched, tears shining in her eyes. She'd seen enough horses ruined by impatience, enough families broken by grief. But this was different. She saw not just a girl and a horse, but two hearts piecing themselves back together, one slow morning at a time. After the session, Emily stroked Storm's neck, pressing her forehead to his mane. "I knew you could do it," she whispered. Storm snuffled her hair, the weight between them lighter somehow, their burdens shared. That afternoon, word got out. The neighbor kids watched from the road, whispering as Emily led Storm through a series of drills. Some looked impressed, others skeptical, but no one dared come too close. Emily didn't care. For the first time in weeks, she felt strong. Not because she'd silenced the doubters, but because she was building something real with Storm, step by careful step. Later, as the sun dipped low, Emily sat on the porch beside Elsie, sipping sweet tea. Her grandmother wiped her eyes with the hem of her apron. "Your daddy would be proud," she said. "Not just for what you're doing, but how you're doing it." Emily smiled, exhausted but happy. "It feels like he's here with us somehow. Like Storm can still hear his voice." Elsie squeezed her hand. "Maybe he can. Horses remember, Emmy, especially the good ones." That night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard a sound outside her window. A low, steady breathing, the scrape of a hoof on gravel. She peeked through the curtains and saw Storm, standing sentinel beneath her window, his dark silhouette a comforting presence in the moonlight. He didn't whinny or paw at the ground. He just stood there, as if keeping watch, promising silently that she was never alone. The next morning, Emily found new confidence. She greeted Storm with a gentle rub on his nose and led him out to the fields. They worked together, repeating the exercises from her father's logs, building trust with every pass. Storm started to move more fluidly, responding to her cues with a growing sense of ease. He remembered more than just commands. He remembered how to trust. Sometimes Emily would pause, reading aloud stories from the logbook about her father's patrols, how Storm had once stood his ground during a thunderstorm, how he'd calmed frightened children during a school visit, how he'd waited quietly at the station until her dad finished his shift. She wondered what memories flickered behind Storm's eyes as he listened. Did he remember the laughter, the late-night rides, the feeling of being part of something bigger? Over the next days, a subtle change spread through the farm. The tension eased. Storm grew calmer, the other animals less skittish. Even the townspeople seemed to notice, their gossip shifting from fear to curiosity. A few stopped by the fence, asking polite questions, watching as Emily and Storm moved together across the pasture. One evening, Elsie joined them, bringing an old photo album. She sat in the grass, flipping pages, telling stories about Emily's father, about the horse he'd loved like a brother. As she spoke, Storm wandered over, lowering his head to nuzzle Elsie's lap, as if remembering too. "He always did have a soft spot for you," Elsie murmured, rubbing Storm's forehead. "Maybe he knows you're keeping his girl safe." Emily felt a warmth spread through her, a blend of memory, hope, and healing. The farm wasn't just a place of sorrow anymore. It was becoming a home again, for both her and Storm. That night, Storm once again stood outside her window, the moon casting his shadow long and gentle across the grass. Emily fell asleep with a smile, the sound of his quiet breathing more comforting than any lullaby. For the first time since her father's death, Emily believed that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The courthouse in Southridge County had always seemed too grand for such a small town. White columns and red bricks rising out of the grass like a relic from another era. Emily had only been inside once, years ago, for a school field trip. Back then, the echoing halls and polished floors had seemed magical, a place where grown-ups made decisions that shaped the world. Now, with Storm's life hanging in the balance, the courthouse felt cold and unforgiving. Word of the dangerous Mustang had swept through the county like wildfire, fanned by rumors and grainy video clips on every phone. By the time the hearing was set, it seemed like the whole town had picked a side. Emily arrived with her grandmother Elsie and Miss Tilda, their faces drawn but determined, pushing through a crowd of neighbors and reporters clustered on the courthouse steps. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. People whispered in the pews, some casting sympathetic glances at Emily, others glaring with suspicion. Sheriff Baker sat at the front, his eyes heavy with worry, while Logan and his father sat on the opposite side, flanked by a few parents who had pushed the town to take action. Logan fidgeted, unable to meet Emily's eyes. His father, a thick-necked man with a jaw like stone, spoke in a booming voice to anyone who'd listen. "That horse is a menace. If they don't act now, we'll have another tragedy on our hands." The judge, a stern woman with kind eyes named Judge Rosen, called the hearing to order. "We are here today to decide the fate of a horse named Storm, accused of being dangerous to the community. I remind everyone to speak with respect. This is not a witch hunt." Emily squeezed her grandmother's hand, the knot in her stomach growing tighter. When her name was called, she stood on shaking legs and walked to the front of the room. Her voice quivered, but she forced herself to speak. "Storm isn't dangerous. He's scared. People have been cruel to him. But he's never hurt anyone. He protected my dad. He protects me. He isn't broken. He's still protecting us." The room grew quiet. Some faces softened, others hardened. Logan's father stood next, waving printed screenshots of social media posts. "You've all seen the videos. That horse went wild. My son says he charged at those kids. We can't risk having him loose near our children." There were murmurs of agreement. Sheriff Baker shifted uncomfortably. "We've never had a formal complaint about Storm until now. And I was there the day Officer Carver died. That horse came back, alone after the accident, injured but not violent." The judge nodded. "Thank you, Sheriff. Anyone else?" A sudden hush fell over the room as Miss Tilda rose, her limp pronounced as she made her way to the front. She stood facing the judge, then turned to the crowd. "I need to tell the truth." Her voice was hoarse but clear. After Officer Carver died, Storm was traumatized. He wouldn't let anyone near. I was hired to retrain him, but I didn't understand the depth of his grief. I pushed too hard. I made mistakes. She paused, her hands trembling. When he panicked, I wrote in my reports that he was dangerous. I was embarrassed by my failure. I changed the records. That's why everyone thinks he's a threat. But it was never his fault. It was mine. A stunned silence followed. Judge Rosen leaned forward. "You're saying the official record of Storm's behavior was falsified?" Miss Tilda nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, Your Honor. I've lived with the guilt for years. But after seeing that video, I know the truth matters more than my pride." For the first time, Logan's father looked uncertain. The crowd began to murmur, the mood shifting as the truth rippled through the room. The judge tapped her gavel. "Thank you, Miss Tilda. I appreciate your honesty. The court will consider this testimony carefully." Emily watched as the judge flipped through the stack of reports, lips pressed in a thin line. After several minutes, she looked up. Given the conflicting reports and the recent revelations, I am ordering that Storm be confined to the Carver property under observation for 2 weeks. During this time, no further accusations or attempts to remove him will be made. At the end of this period, the court will reconvene for a final decision. There was a collective exhale, a pause, not a victory, but not a defeat. Emily's knees nearly buckled with relief. She rushed from the stand and hugged Elsie and Miss Tilda, who both clung to her tightly. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with talk. Some people were angry, muttering about dangerous animals and irresponsible children. But others, especially those who remembered Officer Carver and his horse, seemed quieter, more thoughtful. Logan lingered at the edge of the crowd, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked at Emily, guilt flickering across his face, but said nothing before turning away. As the sun dipped behind the courthouse, Emily looked up at the sky, fighting tears. Storm's fate was still uncertain, but for the first time she felt hope. The truth had finally come out, and with it, a chance for justice. Not just for Storm, but for everyone who'd ever been judged without being truly seen. That evening, back at the farm, Emily visited Storm in the paddock. He stood quietly, watching her approach. She pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "They're giving us a chance, boy. I won't let you down." Storm let out a deep, contented breath, as if he understood. For the next 2 weeks, Emily and Elsie watched him carefully, documenting his behavior, welcoming neighbors who wanted to see for themselves the horse who'd become a symbol of fear, and now maybe of forgiveness. And every night, as Storm stood guard beneath her window, Emily promised herself that no matter what happened next, she would keep fighting, not just for Storm, but for the truth her father had always believed in. The attic of the Carver house was a place few dared to visit. Dust blanketed every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of old cedar, memories, and secrets packed into battered trunks and boxes. Emily had never been up there alone before, but the weight of waiting, the endless uncertainty of Storm's trial, left her restless, searching for something, anything, to help her understand what to do next. She climbed the creaking stairs, a flashlight in one hand and her father's logbook in the other. Each step echoed the heartbeat in her chest. Above her, spiderwebs caught motes of sunlight in delicate, glimmering patterns, as if the past was holding its breath. Emily rummaged through boxes marked Christmas and baby clothes before her eyes fell on an old leather saddle resting atop a pile of canvas bags. She recognized it instantly, the same worn saddle her father had used for every patrol, the one she'd seen in faded photos with Nightstorm. Its leather was cracked, but the brass nameplate still read C. Carver. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers along the stitching, feeling the indentations worn by years of service and love. She set the saddle upright, intending only to polish it, when her fingers brushed against a hard edge beneath the lining. Curious, she dug a little deeper, finding a flap of leather that had come loose. Wedged inside, yellowed and folded small, was an envelope she'd never seen before. Her father's handwriting on the front, neat and steady. "For Emily, if you ever need to know." A chill ran through her. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "Emily, if you're reading this, something's happened that I never wanted. I wish I could explain everything in person, but life's not always fair. I want you to know about Storm, Nightstorm. He's more than a horse. He's a friend, a protector, and he loves you like I do. If anything ever happens to me, Storm will find you. He'll know. Trust him, and never doubt your heart. It's stronger than you think." Emily pressed the letter to her chest. the words blurring through tears. All this time her father had known. He'd trusted that Storm would be there for her, even when no one else believed. Heart pounding, she hurried down the attic steps and burst out into the afternoon sun. Storm stood at the fence, ears pricked, as if he'd been waiting for her. Without thinking, Emily rushed to him, flinging her arms around his neck and sobbing into his mane. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You really did. You found me. You never left." Storm nuzzled her gently, his dark eyes soft with understanding. It was as if the words her father had written were alive in this moment, binding horse and girl with invisible threads of loyalty and love. That evening, Emily sat on the porch with Elsie and Miss Tilda, the letter laid out before them. They read it together, passing it back and forth in reverent silence. Elsie wiped her eyes. "Your daddy knew what he was doing. He trusted Storm to take care of you." Miss Tilda nodded, voice thick. "That horse is here for a reason. He came back for you." Word of the letter spread quickly. The next day, Emily mustered all her courage and shared its contents at school, reading it aloud in homeroom as teachers and classmates listened in stunned silence. "If anything happens, Storm will find you. He'll know. Trust him." The story swept through the town. People who had doubted Storm began to reconsider. Some stopped Emily in the street to offer kind words, or to share stories of her father, how he'd helped them, how Storm had once comforted a lost child during a thunderstorm, how the two of them had been inseparable. Others, still wary, kept their distance, but the tide was turning. The letter had given Emily a voice, her father's voice, stronger than fear or rumor. Social media posts from Southridge lit up with messages of hope, love, and remembrance. The local news station ran a segment about Officer Carver's legacy and Storm's loyalty, ending with a plea for compassion. "Sometimes, what we fear most is simply what we don't understand," the anchor concluded. That weekend, Emily hosted an open afternoon at the farm. Dozens of neighbors came to see Storm, not as a monster, but as the horse who had carried grief and love across years and heartbreak. Emily stood in the paddock with Storm, reading her father's words for anyone who would listen. Children brought apples and carrots, whispering to Storm as he ate from their hands. Even Logan showed up, lingering on the edge of the crowd, unable to meet Emily's gaze but watching, listening. That night, after everyone left, Emily sat with Storm beneath the wide, starry sky. She ran her fingers through his mane, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "I'm not scared anymore," she said softly. "You and me, we can handle anything." Storm blew a gentle breath across her face, as if agreeing. For the first time, Emily felt the ache of her father's absence soften, not disappear, but change shape, becoming something she could hold without breaking. Back inside, she tucked the letter away in her drawer, beneath her pillow. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Never doubt your heart. It's stronger than you think." And for the first time in a long while, Emily believed it. Underscore, 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 underscore. The wind had shifted in Southridge County. Where fear and suspicion once clung to the fences of Wayland Farm, something new now drifted through the air. Curiosity, cautious hope, and a quiet buzz of excitement. Word of Emily's letter and the horse who had kept her father's final promise traveled quickly. By the weekend, so many people wanted to see Storm that Elsie and Emily decided to open their gates to the community for a special afternoon, one that would change everything. They spent the morning working together, transforming the battered pasture into a welcoming space. Elsie hung a hand-painted sign over the gate, Carver's Circle, in honor of the new beginning they hoped was coming. Emily raked up old straw, set out benches and picnic tables, and brushed Storm until his coat shone. Miss Tilda arrived early, bringing a tray of homemade cookies and a stack of battered photo albums full of memories. By noon, the farm buzzed with life. Children from Emily's school crept shyly toward the fence, parents in tow. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street now smiled and waved. Even Sheriff Baker stopped by, tipping his hat and handing Emily a faded badge from his own first patrol. A little luck, he winked. But the biggest change arrived when a white van pulled up near the barn, bearing a sign, Southridge Equine Therapy. Out stepped Mrs. Henley, the county's new equine therapist, a kind-eyed woman whose gentle voice carried even in the breeze. She introduced herself to Emily and Elsie, explaining, "I've heard so much about Storm. I think he might help more people than you know." Emily felt a rush of pride mixed with nerves. Could Storm, once the most feared animal in the county, really become a healer for others? Mrs. Henley led a small group of children to the fence, each carrying a different weight. One boy, Daniel, hadn't spoken in months after his father's accident. A little girl named Sophie barely looked up from her shoes. Mrs. Henley spoke softly to each, guiding them in how to greet Storm. Emily stood close, whispering encouragement. At first, Storm eyed the new faces warily, but when Daniel reached out, offering a shaky hand full of carrots, Storm stepped forward, lowering his head. He sniffed Daniel's palm, then gently nuzzled his shoulder. Daniel's lips parted in surprise, a slow, uncertain smile blooming for the first time in ages. The adults fell silent, watching as Storm moved with surprising patience among the children. Sophie, clutching a stuffed rabbit, edged closer. Storm lowered himself to the ground, folding his long legs with awkward care, and waited. Emily saw Sophie's small hand touch Storm's mane. For the first time, the little girl raised her head, meeting Emily's gaze with a tearful smile. It was as if Storm knew exactly who needed him and how. One after another, the children approached, some laughing, some crying. Storm responded to each with quiet strength, never spooking, never shying away, even when Daniel broke into sudden sobs. Instead, the Mustang pressed his head into the boy's chest, standing so still that Daniel's cries faded into quiet, then into words. "He's not scary," Daniel whispered, looking up at Mrs. Henley and Emily. "He's just sad, like me." Mrs. Henley nodded, blinking back tears. Sometimes the best healers are the ones who have been hurt too. The afternoon turned into a celebration. Parents mingled by the gate, sharing stories of Officer Carver and the horse who had once patrolled the town. Neighbors passed around Miss Tilda's photo albums, pointing out old parades, school visits, and the day Storm had calmed a group of children during a tornado drill. But the moment that stayed with Emily happened, as dusk settled over Carver's Circle. Sophie, whose mother had died in a fire, wandered back to the paddock after most visitors had left. Emily followed, unsure whether to speak. She watched as Sophie sat quietly in the grass, eyes red and distant. Storm, sensing her sadness, walked over and lowered himself beside her, legs folding in a careful heap. Sophie leaned into Storm's side, burying her face in his mane. Emily stood nearby, heart in her throat, as Sophie's small body shook with sobs. Storm didn't move. He simply lay there, a silent shield, until Sophie's crying slowed. When she finally stood, she pressed a kiss to Storm's nose and whispered, "Thank you," so soft that only Emily heard. As the last guests left, Mrs. Henley approached Emily and Elsie. "Storm has a gift. I've never seen anything like it." Would you consider letting us use him for regular therapy sessions here? We could help a lot of children who need what he offers. Emily looked to Elsie, who nodded. He's always been a healer, even if we didn't see it before. That night, after everyone had gone and the fields had gone quiet, Emily sat in the grass beside Storm. She traced the scar on his chest, no longer seeing it as a mark of shame, but as proof of everything he'd survived. "You're not just my hero, are you?" she whispered. "You're theirs too." Storm lowered his head, resting it on her lap. Emily stroked his mane, feeling the peace that came from knowing they had changed something, not just for themselves, but for the community, for every lost or hurting child who might find hope in the company of a horse who'd known his own kind of sorrow. The farm was different now. The fear was gone, replaced by laughter and the soft hush of healing. Carver's Circle had become more than a name. It was a promise, a place where pain could be carried, shared, and slowly turned into something like grace. And every night, Storm stood beneath Emily's window, not as a guard against the world, but as a quiet reminder. Even the deepest scars could help light the way for someone else. Spring arrived in Southridge County with a burst of color. Wildflowers climbed the fences at Wayland Farm, and the first real warmth of the year filled the air with the scent of clover and cut grass. The whole town seemed to buzz in anticipation for the annual Southridge Spring Festival, the biggest event of the year, where families gathered for games, parades, and fried pies sold from booths that stretched down Main Street. This year, there was extra excitement. For the first time, Storm would be featured in the festival's main event, a demonstration meant to show that the once feared Mustang was no longer a menace, but a symbol of hope and healing for Southridge. Emily had spent weeks preparing, working with Mrs. Henley and Miss Tilda to make sure Storm was comfortable with crowds, music, and the bustle of children running everywhere. The morning of the festival, Emily woke before dawn, nerves dancing in her stomach. She brushed Storm until his black coat gleamed and braided his mane with blue ribbons, the same color as her father's old patrol shirt. Elsie tucked a lucky silver button into Emily's pocket, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Just do what you've always done. Trust each other," she said. At the fairgrounds, the crowd was bigger than Emily had imagined. Stalls lined the field, selling everything from lemonade to hand-carved horseshoes. Families clustered near the show ring, children balanced on hay bales. Sheriff Baker and Mrs. Henley stood at the front, ready to introduce the demonstration. Even Logan was there, hanging back near the edge, hands shoved in his pockets. The air vibrated with noise, laughter, music, the sharp bang of a distant hammer on a carnival ride. Storm shifted uneasily as Emily led him through the gate, nostrils flaring. She whispered calming words, remembering her father's old commands. The crowd quieted as Mrs. Henley took the microphone. "Folks, please welcome Storm, and the bravest girl I know, Emily Carver." Applause thundered through the field. Emily swallowed her nerves and mounted up, riding Storm slowly around the ring. She demonstrated simple commands: stop, walk, trot, then braved a few low jumps. Storm performed beautifully, moving with calm confidence, his ears flicking back toward Emily's steady voice. But not everyone in the crowd was rooting for them. From behind the barn, Logan and a group of older boys whispered together, the weight of guilt and jealousy heavy between them. Logan's father had insisted Storm was still dangerous, and Logan, caught between loyalty and shame, wanted to prove to everyone, maybe even to himself, that he wasn't afraid. In a reckless, desperate moment, he grabbed a handful of leftover fireworks from a vendor's booth. As Emily guided Storm toward the center of the ring for the final salute, A sudden crack split the air. Then another and another. Red and gold sparks burst from behind the barn, echoing through the fairgrounds. Storm froze, muscles tensed, then spun around, nostrils flaring and eyes wide with panic. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. A group of children near the fence screamed and ducked. Storm reared, hooves pawing the air, nearly unseating Emily. She gripped the reins, heart pounding, remembering everything her father had taught her. How fear could flood a horse's mind, how panic could turn even the gentlest soul wild. "Storm!" she called, her voice steady and low, even as her own fear threatened to swallow her. "It's okay, boy, I'm here, listen to me." Storm's eyes rolled, and for a moment Emily feared he would bolt, trampling the crowd or crashing through the fence. But then, through the chaos, she remembered the weight of her father's badge in her pocket. She reached down, pressing it against Storm's neck, whispering, "I trust you. We're together." Just as Storm whirled toward the nearest gate, a small child tripped in his path, frozen in fear. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Storm stopped, utterly still. The crowd held its breath. Emily slid from his back and hurried to the child, lifting him out of harm's way. Storm remained frozen, trembling but unmoving, eyes locked on Emily as if waiting for her next cue. She turned and walked slowly toward him, open-palmed and unafraid, just as she'd done the first night in the paddock. "It's okay, Storm. I'm here." Storm took a shaky step forward, then another, his breath evening out as he recognized Emily's scent, her calm presence cutting through the panic. The crowd watched, silent, as horse and girl reunited at the center of the ring. Emily hugged Storm's neck, tears streaming down her cheeks, relief flooding her chest. Sheriff Baker hurried over, checking on the child, who was shaken but unharmed. Parents gathered their children, murmurs of fear replaced by whispers of awe. Someone in the crowd began to clap, then others joined, until the ring echoed with cheers and shouts of encouragement. Meanwhile, behind the barn, Logan stood frozen, the spent fireworks still smoldering at his feet. Shame washed over him. He watched as Emily comforted Storm, and something inside him cracked. He stepped out from behind the barn, voice shaking. "It was me," he called, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I set off the fireworks. I thought he'd go wild, but he's not like that. He's not like my dad." The crowd turned, some murmuring in surprise, others shaking their heads. Sheriff Baker walked over, resting a gentle hand on Logan's shoulder. "It's not too late to make things right, son." Emily heard Logan's confession, her heart aching. She walked over to him, Storm trailing at her side. Logan looked at her, eyes red. "I'm sorry, I thought if I showed everyone he was dangerous, maybe my dad would forgive me for being scared." Emily placed a hand on his arm. "Storm's scared too. We all are sometimes. But he doesn't pass his pain on to anyone else. That's what makes him different." Logan nodded, tears falling freely. The crowd, seeing the raw truth in both children, finally understood. The festival, once shadowed by fear, became a place of reckoning and forgiveness. That evening, as the sun set over the fairgrounds, Emily led Storm through the crowd one last time. People reached out to touch his mane, thank her, and offer quiet apologies for the things they'd believed. Logan walked beside her, no longer an enemy, but a friend beginning to heal. And in that golden light, Storm, no longer a legend of fear, but a living symbol of courage, became the heart of Southridge, the horse who had carried pain but never turned it into harm. On a warm Friday afternoon, the Southridge Middle School auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and townsfolk. The school's annual essay competition had always been a proud event. But this year, the air buzzed with something different. Expectation. A sense that the community was gathering not just to hear stories, but to witness a kind of healing. Emily stood behind the heavy red curtain, her heart pounding in her chest. Storm waited outside, head bowed in the soft shade of an oak tree, almost as if he understood he was part of something bigger than any one person. Emily wore her father's badge on a chain around her neck, her hands steady as she held her note cards. She looked over the crowd from the wings, faces she knew, faces that had once glared in suspicion, and now looked on with hope, and some, like Logan's, with apology in their eyes. When her name was called, the applause was thunderous. Emily walked out, every step measured, and took her place at the microphone. She scanned the room, found her grandmother and Miss Tilda in the front row, then took a deep breath. "My essay is called What Storm Carried," she began, her voice echoing in the quiet hall. "Some people say that animals can't feel the way we do. They say that horses, even smart ones, forget the past. But I've learned that isn't true." She glanced down at Storm outside the window, and the words came easier than she'd feared. Storm didn't forget pain. He carried it. But he never passed it on. After my dad died, Storm came home alone, covered in scars. People thought he was dangerous because he was wild and afraid. Maybe I was too. Maybe we both carried grief the same way, silently, letting it weigh us down, waiting for someone to understand. The auditorium was silent except for her voice. Some people tried to use fear to get rid of Storm, but fear never helped anybody, not really. Storm never hurt anyone, not even when people tried to hurt him. He just waited, and when he found someone who remembered him, he let himself hope again. Emily's hands shook, but her voice stayed strong. What I learned from Storm is that being strong doesn't mean never being hurt. It means carrying what hurts, and still being gentle to others. Storm stood by me every night, even when the town was against us. He watched out for the kids who needed him, let them cry into his mane, gave them comfort when nothing else would. She paused, swallowing past the lump in her throat. The bravest thing Storm ever did wasn't running into danger. It was refusing to let his scars make him cruel. He didn't pass his pain to anyone else. He turned it into kindness, into protection, into love. In the front row, several people dabbed at their eyes. Even some of the older boys, who'd once mocked her, looked down in embarrassment or awe. Emily drew in a breath and continued. "I think that's the real meaning of strength. Not fighting, not running away, but being there. Standing by someone even when it's hard. That's what my dad taught me, and what Storm keeps teaching me every day." She looked at the judges, veterans, teachers, and a few retired officers, some with tears in their eyes. Storm's journey is about more than just a horse. It's about every person who's ever lost someone and wondered if they'd ever heal. It's about carrying memories, even the painful ones, and turning them into something good. Not pretending the past didn't happen, but making sure it doesn't hurt anyone else. She finished with a quiet, powerful line. "Sometimes, the strongest ones are those who've been hurt the most and choose not to hurt back." A hush fell over the room as she stepped down. Then, slowly at first, the applause rose, soft, then louder, swelling into a standing ovation. Emily walked outside to where Storm waited, his head lowering to her shoulder as she pressed her face into his mane. Outside, people gathered around, not asking for selfies or daring her to prove something, but just to thank her, to touch Storm's shoulder, to share stories of their own losses and scars. Veterans in their uniforms nodded to Emily, understanding in their eyes. A retired officer placed a gentle hand on Storm's neck, whispering, "You did good, boy. Real good." Emily felt the weight of the last year settle on her, but it wasn't the heavy ache of grief anymore. It was something different, a sense of belonging, of connection to a community that had been broken, but was now knitting itself back together. That night, at home, Emily and Elsie sat on the porch while Miss Tilda flipped through old photo albums. Storm grazed quietly in the field, the sunset turning his scar into a silver ribbon across his chest. Emily thought about everything they'd survived, rumors, fear, even near tragedy, and realized that, like Storm, she hadn't gotten rid of her scars. She'd just learned to carry them with purpose. She whispered to the wind, "We made it, Dad. You were right. Storm found me, and I found myself." As dusk settled over Carver's circle, Storm wandered up to the porch, nudging Emily's shoulder, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. She leaned into him, her own silent promise echoing the lesson she'd learned. Healing doesn't erase the past. It just means you're strong enough to carry it, and to help someone else carry theirs too. Carver's circle was almost unrecognizable by late summer. Where once there were only weeds and broken fences, now sturdy rails encircled lush grass, and wildflowers bloomed along the borders. The old Whalen farm paddock, once a place of fear, was now a sanctuary, alive with the laughter of children and the gentle nickering of rescued horses. A new wooden sign, polished and hand-painted, swung over the gate. Carver's Circle, where healing runs free. Storm, graying around his muzzle, but still proud and strong, stood beneath that sign as if he understood the honor. His eyes followed Emily wherever she went, patient and kind, never far from the girl who had changed his story, and whose life he had changed in return. Emily, now taller, carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from surviving storms no one else could see. Each morning she rose with the sun, her father's badge around her neck, and walked out to the fields. She trained rescue horses with the same calm, persistent patience she'd learned from Storm. Her laughter echoed across the grass as children arrived for their sessions. Kids who'd lost parents, who carried invisible wounds, or who just needed a place where the world felt safe. Elsie watched it all from her favorite bench beneath the willow tree, her husband's retired patrol hat perched beside her. Sometimes she'd wipe away tears, of sorrow but mostly of pride. On a warm afternoon, Emily guided a new rescue, a shy chestnut mare, around the ring, while Storm watched nearby, ears flicking in gentle encouragement. A little girl, her eyes still shadowed with grief, wrapped her arms around Storm's leg and clung to him, trusting the old mustang with the kind of absolute faith that only children and those who have suffered know how to give. Storm lowered his head, breathing out in a sigh that ruffled the girl's hair, and for a moment, everything felt whole. Visitors came from all over now, some for healing, some just to see the horse who had become a legend. Families brought picnics and watched as Emily led her small herd through gentle exercises. Sometimes, Emily would share Storm's story, her voice ringing out across the pasture, not as a tale of danger or loss, but as a living lesson in courage and compassion. One day, Mrs. Henley and Miss Tilda organized a day of thanks, inviting the whole community to celebrate. There was music, food, and a special ceremony in honor of Officer Carver and the legacy he left behind, not just as a patrolman, but as a father, a friend, and a believer in second chances. During the ceremony, Elsie placed her husband's old patrol hat on the fence beside the Carver's Circle sign. She spoke quietly, voice trembling with love. "Charlie always said you judge a soul by how it carries its scars. Storm taught us all that true strength is quiet, steady, and kind. Logan, now a volunteer at the sanctuary, shared his own story. A story of anger and shame turned into understanding. I used to think strength was about being tough, about hiding pain, he admitted, looking out over the crowd. But Storm showed me it's about standing by the people who need you, even when you're scared. It's about never letting your hurt turn into hate. Emily hugged him, grateful for forgiveness, and for the boy who had learned, like her, to walk with his pain instead of running from it. As the sun set, the crowd gathered by the paddock for one last tribute. Emily climbed onto the fence, Storm beside her, and spoke to everyone, voice steady, eyes shining. I used to think being brave meant never being afraid, she began. But Storm taught me that it's about carrying your fear, your grief, your scars, and choosing love anyway. He was never just a horse. He was my family's protector, a friend to anyone who needed him, and a chapter in this town's story that almost got skipped. She paused, scanning the faces. So many who had once doubted, who now stood together, united by the journey of a horse and a girl. Storm's legacy isn't in trophies or medals. It's in every quiet moment of kindness, in every child who finds comfort in a gentle touch, in every neighbor who chooses to understand instead of judge. This place, Carver's Circle, is for everyone who's ever carried weight in silence, and for anyone who needs a place to heal. As she finished, the crowd stood in quiet respect. The golden light bathed Storm, Emily, and all the gathered souls, turning the paddock into a sanctuary of memory and hope. Later that night, when the fields had emptied and the moon hung high, Emily lingered by the fence with Storm. She traced the letters on the sign with her finger, her heart full but not heavy. "I'm not scared of storms anymore," she whispered. "Not when I know we can walk through them together." Elsie joined her, slipping an arm around Emily's shoulders. "He was a chapter we nearly skipped," she said softly. "But you gave him a voice, Emmy. And in doing that, you found your own." Emily nodded, her thoughts drifting to everyone who had come and gone. Her father, Logan, the children, even the doubters. She realized that what Storm had given them all was not just healing, but a way to turn pain into passage for others. So if you've been moved by Storm's story, if you've ever felt weighed down by loss or judgment or fear, remember, you don't have to carry it alone. Healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about finding the courage to walk with it and to help someone else along the way. Share this story with someone who needs it. Somewhere out there, another voice waits to be heard, and another storm waits to be understood. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please like and follow our channel. There's always another story, and always another chance for hope.